He did. Now, let's go to then the last excerpt that I wanted to highlight, which is President Zelensky speaking, and he says, "I also wanted to thank you for your invitation to visit the United States, specifically Washington, D.C. On the other hand, I also want to assure you that we will be very serious about the case and we will work on the investigation." Now, Ambassador Taylor, right after President Zelensky mentions his much desired Washington visit, he says, "on the other hand," and then says that Ukraine will be very serious about the investigation. Is this the same link between the White House visit and the investigations that Ambassador Volker had texted to Andrei Yermak just a few minutes before this conversation?
That's my assumption.
Now, just to summarize what we've just read in this July 25th call between the presidents, the Ukrainian president thanked President Trump for security assistance that President Trump had just frozen, to which President Trump responded that he wanted President Zelensky to do him a favor, though, by investigating the 2016 U.S. election and the Bidens. Then President Zelensky says that he will pursue these investigations right after he mentions the White House visit. Is that your understanding, Ambassador Taylor, of what we just read?
Yes.
And Mr. Kent, is that yours?
Yes.
I yield back.
The majority time has expired. Would you gentlemen like a brief recess? Well, let's take a 5-minute recess and then we'll resume with minority questioning.
The first round of questioning there has ended for George Kent, for William Taylor, the two public servants who have served in the State Department, served in Ukraine, the acting ambassador to Ukraine, the deputy assistant secretary of state overseeing Ukraine, laying out in meticulous, precise, specific testimony their interactions with what William Taylor called both a regular channel dealing with Ukraine policy in the United States government and this irregular channel that was included the president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. Also something that we weren't really expecting today, new information, even though both gentlemen had given depositions before. William Taylor came forward with new information, a July 26th phone call between Ambassador Sondland and a member of Taylor's staff, where Taylor's staff overheard President Trump on that phone call with Ambassador Sondland talking about the investigations he referred to in that July 25th phone call with the Ukrainian president. As we said, this is brand new information. So I want to go to our senior congressional correspondent, Mary Bruce. And Mary, to the best of our knowledge, this is not a phone call that Ambassador Sondland testified about. As we heard from William Taylor, this is something he learned about only last week.
Yeah, George, to our knowledge, this is the first that we have heard of this call. Ambassador Sondland, as far as we can tell, did not tell investigators about this phone call during his initial testimony or when he updated that testimony. It is surprising because there have been a lot of questions, of course, about Sondland's truthfulness. So far, he, of course, did update his initial testimony after he said his memory was refreshed by the testimony of other witnesses. And we should say Sondland did concede that it's possible that there were other calls with the president that he could not recall, but there are now going to be a lot more questions for the ambassador. And George, of course, he is set to testify here next Wednesday in another public hearing.
And Mary, as this was happening, we also got a new information from the committee. They've scheduled 2 more depositions for Friday and Saturday, including a man named David Holmes, who is listed as a counselor to the the embassy in Ukraine. A lot of speculation that this is the staffer who heard the phone call, but do we know that yet?
George, we are trying to still nail down exactly which staffer may have been the one who was there with Sondland, who heard or overheard the president during that phone call with the ambassador. There will be a lot more questions for him as well during these closed-door depositions as everyone here on the Hill tries to nail down exactly what happened on that phone call and who overheard it. And, George, it also goes to the point that the pace of this investigation, that they are still having these depositions while they're pressing forward with these public hearings.
David Muir, as I said, this was not something we expected coming into the hearing today.
You know, really not at all, George. In fact, it goes straight to the heart of this question, which was also asked of Bill Taylor. Did he believe that Ambassador Gordon Sondland had a direct line to President Trump? And you heard Bill Taylor here today say, yes, in fact, I believe that's true. And when talking about that staff member, this was a conversation that Bill Taylor was talking about today that we had not heard about before. It had happened, according to Taylor, the day after the phone call between President Trump and the president of Ukraine, and that it was a staff member of Bill Taylor's who could overhear Ambassador Sondland talking with President Trump, that he could hear President Trump through the phone. This is Taylor's contention, that the staff member could hear the president ask about investigations. Bill Taylor was then pressed here today, what does investigations mean to you? And he repeated what he had said before, that investigations meant Biden and 2016. And that Sondland said to the president on the phone, the staff member could hear this, that the Ukrainians are ready to move forward with those investigations. So, as you can imagine, George, a lot of speculation at this hour about who that staff member might have been and whether or not, as you point out, we'll be hearing from that staff member in testimony in the days going forward.
Yeah, new depositions have now been scheduled. Let's bring in our legal team right here. So that's the new information that we just heard. But if you take it as a whole, and I think we saw something different here for a congressional testimony, the difference that you get when a lawyer goes through 45 minutes of sustained questioning with witnesses who appear to want to cooperate. And Dan, what I think we saw there, especially with William Taylor's testimony, laying out in very clear terms that from his perspective, the aid and the White House meeting were clearly conditioned on Ukraine taking up these investigations that President Trump wanted.
I think the single most important takeaway that the Democrats hope the public leaves with is that just because the president said the words, it's not a quid pro quo, it was a quid pro quo. And you see him focusing on that a lot, which is the president said it, but then it was clear that the aid was conditioned upon the investigations, which is a quid pro quo. And I think that's critical. I also say one other thing. We're talking a lot about this new information about what was overheard. And I can just see the Republicans getting ready to say to this person, wait, you overheard this? How close were you? You were listening in on the conversation, etc. I think just as important, if not more important, is the next point, which is following the call with President Trump. The member of the staff then asks Sondland what President Trump thought about Ukraine, and that Sondland responds that President Trump cares more about the investigations of Biden, which Giuliani was pressing for. Because now you have this staffer able to come in and not just say, here's what I overheard, but I actually followed up with Sondland. I asked him this particular question, and here was his response.
And clearly what they're trying to do there is they lay out this case, saying it is very clear the president was doing something for his personal interest, not the national interest.
Right, that's right. And I do agree with Dan. This sort of no quid pro quo case has been falling apart for some days, but I think that today you see the fact that you just speak the words no quid pro quo, but then everyone involved, really on both sides, both on the U.S. side and eventually on the Ukrainian side, understand that there is this linkage between the aid and the White House meeting and these investigations.
And Barbara, one of the things we've seen so far, and we'll wait and see what the Republican question like is as we come back from this 5-minute break, is the president in some of his retweets and several members of the committee, Republican members of the committee, hanging a lot on the idea that Taylor and Kent were not getting firsthand, for the most part, information.
Yes, I think that's why today's testimony is interesting, because of this firsthand account. And as Dan pointed out, he followed up. It wasn't just overhearing, it was that firsthand account. And this goes to why it's so important to have these public hearings, because obviously this staffer heard about some of the testimony as it was released and publicly available, and that jogged his memory of what he had seen. But I think this is also why you're going to see the Republicans are also emphasizing, well, the money was released anyway. There's no, if the money was released, then
no harm, no foul.
Exactly. And so a little bit like what happened with Don McGahn. He didn't follow the directions. Everything ended up okay. So these kind of things won't matter.
Let me bring in John Carl, our chief White House correspondent, as well. As I said, John, the president, at least the president's account, lots of retweets from the president's accounts during this testimony, and you saw the Democratic lawyer Daniel Goldman go to great pains to take the president up on his invitation to read that transcript, to read the transcript of the president's July 25th phone call with the clear intent of showing that the theories in the investigations the president wanted were basically conspiracy theories.
Yes, this was the idea that somehow Ukraine was the source of the interference in the 2016 election, not Russia, and that the server that held those Democratic emails that were hacked somehow resides in Ukraine. It's a theory that has been widely debunked, including by the president's own former Homeland Security advisor, our own Tom Bossert, ABC analyst now. But George, the president was just a few moments ago asked about the hearings, he said, it's a witch hunt, it's a hoax. I'm too busy to watch. I have not been briefed. But as you point out, during this entire morning of testimony, the president's Twitter account has been quite active, retweeting quotes from Republican lawmakers during this hearing.
Yeah, I was actually struck by when the question came up, when this new information came up, there were actually 4 retweets from the president's account within a minute of that new information coming up. I want to go back to Mary Bruce now on Capitol Hill, because you do now have some reaction from one of the senior Republicans on the committee, Mark Meadows.
Yeah, Mark Meadows is actually speaking to reporters right here next to me, and I just asked him about this new revelation from Bill Taylor about that phone call that his staffer overheard between Gordon Sondland and the president, where the president referenced these investigations. And Mark Meadows, not surprisingly, seems to be dismissing many of these new revelations. He says that what Taylor's testifying to is simply second and third-hand information. He notes that Taylor did not initially testify to this conversation, but Taylor, of course, says he just learned of this information in the last few days. I asked Congressman Meadows whether it raises additional questions for him about Gordon Sondland, who also did not testify to that phone call that he allegedly had with the president. Congressman Meadows also does not seem to be particularly concerned about that, George.
And Mayor, we now have confirmed that the staffer who did speak with William Taylor was David Holmes, one of his counselors in the embassy in Ukraine, and he is scheduled for a deposition on Friday. I want to bring in Terry Moran for more on this as well. You know, Terry, taking a step back, and we heard a lot about the background of both Mr. Kent and Mr. Taylor as they led in with their testimony. Whatever else do you think of these gentlemen, the portraits of 2 career public service patriots who, in subdued tones, were quite alarmed by what they were seeing?
And for many people, George, that demeanor and that background that they have is going to be persuasive. But I think the drama that we're going to see play out in these hearings today and in succeeding hearings is the question of who do the American people want operating in their interest? That traditional establishment, really what Harry Truman used to call the striped pants boys at the State Department, who have given their lives to public service, both of these men, in admirable ways, and who have a certain view of how the United States and the United States president should behave in the world. Or this disruptive, this populist president who has come to office determined to wreck things in a way, to change things, sent there to change things, and he's operating in a very different way. One of the things that we may be seeing here as part of a defense of the president is he may have had an irregular foreign policy going on, but it didn't really, as you've pointed out, change policy. No harm, no foul. This is somewhat akin to what the Mueller investigation determined. While the president did not conspire or coordinate with the Kremlin, the evidence showed, he welcomed and encouraged it. These aren't sort of sinister, professional, uber-competent conspirators. They're rookies in public office in some ways, sort of groping their way to what they believe the American people want.
And that gets to the question of intent, but on your point, that is something we hadn't seen before. In fact, in Mark Burstein, if you're listening, if we can pull up the soundbite number 222, it gets to that point of how different this was, at least for Ambassador Taylor. Let's look.
Ambassador Taylor, in your decades of military service and diplomatic service representing the United States around the world, have you ever seen another example of foreign aid conditioned on the personal or political interests of the President of the United States?
No, Mr. Goldman, I've not.
I want to bring in Matthew Dowd on that as well. You've served in a White House, Republican White House, for George W. Bush, and that exchange right there gets to the heart of at least part of the case the Democrats are going to make, that this was not the use of power, but abuse of power.
Well, yeah, I think that's fundamental. And to go off something what Terry said, it's not the fact they couldn't get away with it. An attempted robbery is still a crime, even if you don't get away with what you were attempting to do in this. I'd like to reflect all the information is important, but it's really important, I think, the American public, the presence of these public servants. These are not wild-eyed partisans. These are people that serve the country. They're just providing this in a manner, in a calm, cool manner without drama. And I think that is such a contrast to what people hear from the president that I think just the presence of these public servants, the weight of what they did, you now understand why the Democrats picked these two men to go first in these hearings.
Down to the voice of William Taylor. I'm sure I'm not the only one who noticed the echoes of Walter Cronkite. I guess I'm old enough to remember Walter Cronkite right there, but in his voice. But I also want to bring in Pierre Thomas for more on this, our senior justice correspondent.
We're fixing to end this part one. I don't know how many parts that I'm going to be able to actually streamline from national TV. First thing I want to bring up to my viewers is that this is not on MSNBC. This is on a main network, ABC, NBC, and probably CBS. These are our main bloodlines to our communications to the public that is being broadcasted to the general public, not just here in the United States, but all over the world. Also, I want to bring out the fact that, yeah, even though the aid eventually got given to the Ukrainians, the people over in Ukraine, it is very, very likely, not just possible, but likely, that aid would have never gotten to the Ukrainians if the whistleblower did not draw such close attention to what had been said in the format that it had been said in. It was only after Donald Trump realized that he had been caught red-handed in his attempts towards wanting to do something for himself that basically opened up the commitment that had already been made before Donald Trump even had any say-so about the commitment towards going ahead and giving it a green light towards it going through. Just like the individual just spoke about, an attempted bank robbery is still against the law. You have still committed a crime, even though the bank robber or the bank robbers didn't get away with the money like they thought, or maybe the money had a red dye explosive package put in it to the point that that the money was useless after they got down the road and the red dye exploded in the bag or the box or whatever that the money was in. The attempt of a bank robbery is still a crime, even though you may not have gotten scot-free towards actually robbing the bank. You still attempted to rob the bank. There's so many different parallels here. And you got to understand which one is the one that we govern ourselves by here in the United States. And it's just as the Speaker House Nancy has made mention that even the president is not above the law whenever it comes to doing things in the proper protocol. And whenever you're doing things in an improper protocol, that's where people like a whistleblower, a person with no bias intent one way or the other said, maybe you should look at this, and then it become a credible concern of what was actually being said and in the atmosphere that it was being said in. And I've said that all along. A lot of times it's not so much what you say, but how you go about saying it that can become awful, awful offensive into a lot of people. And it don't really have nothing to do with the tone of your voice. You can scream and holler all day long, But if what you're screaming and hollering is just a bunch of blurry stuff that don't make no sense to begin with, you know, all you're doing is screaming and hollering. But now, if what you're saying is just as vitally important as the nature in what you're saying it in, then people becomes judgmental in, well, why did he say that? What did he intend by making that analogy, you know, towards there's going to be a stalemate. There's going to be a stalemate? Really? So in other words, you're not going to fulfill your obligations that prior administrations has already made with the Ukrainian government simply because maybe you don't like who got elected? Or maybe because you feel like that we're not holding up on our end of the bargain towards paying you back the way that we should be paying you back? Once more, I'm sure the people over in Ukraine are very, very grateful, humbly, sincerely grateful that Ronald Reagan done what he done for those people, because they knew that they was being controlled. They knew that they was basically nothing more than puppets, robots, to the communist-controlled country over in the old Yugoslavia, the USSR. And they wanted to break away. But they needed somebody to be their voice. They needed somebody to stand up for them. They needed some sort of support. And now, all of a sudden, you got Donald Trump that comes along and says, well, yeah, I'm going to support you, but I got something that I need from you, which violates our foreign policy with our allies. There's no doubt that whenever we form an alliance with other institutions, one hand helps wash the other. In other words, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. That's a given. That's a given. That's in any establishment, regardless whether it be in government, in friendship, in relationships, in privatized business, or any other type of, I mean, if you plan on having a long, lengthy relationship, you got to realize that there is give or take. It doesn't matter if it's on a personal level or on a government level. There's that give or take. Hey, all right, I'm going to do this, you're going to do that, and we're going to keep this ball rolling. We're going to keep things going. We're going to keep this business open. We're going to keep this home connected as a home. We're going to keep this relationship moving. Though there may be some dislikes, but there's also likes. That's the reason why whenever people make the vows that they make, for better or worse, you realize whenever you're committing to that relationship, for better or worse, that you're going to get the better out of that relationship. But at the same time, sometimes you may get the worse. A matter of fact, a lot of times in that relationship, you may feel like that you got burnt, or you may feel like that you got the short end of the stick. I think that's one reason why so many divorces happen here in America, is because there's too much expected out of each other in the regard of relationships. And whenever people make their vows, for better or worse, in actuality, they really didn't mean it. Well, whenever you're dealing with government affairs, there's a certain criteria that's a given pertaining to the same thing on a relationship. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. One hand helps wash the other. Donald Trump was not using that same criteria. He was venturing off into areas that was going to benefit him at the expense of lives over in the Ukraine by asking the Ukrainian new elected official to conduct an investigation on his rival, on his opponent, Mr. Biden. That's where Mr. Donald Trump stepped over the line and basically no longer was in the interest of the American people, but now was solely in the interest of himself towards becoming reelected so that he could find dirt on Mr. Biden to bring embarrassment into his life. Like I said a while ago, these are my opinions. These are our opinions, the founder of the Windmill Ministries. We have a right to our opinions. And whenever other people listen to this on YouTube or whatever other area that I want to put it on later on in the future, regardless whether it be Facebook or Twitter or whatever, you have your own conscience to go by. You have your own mind to be ruled under. You have your own heart to be persuaded in. And if you choose to want to tally up the same way that we're tallying up here in regard to our opinions, then so be it. And if you don't, then so be that too as well, because we're not going to restrain your right to your opinion about these government affairs pertaining to Donald Trump and the Ukrainians. We're not going to restrain your right to your opinion, neither nor any more than you should restrain our right to our opinion about how we feel. Now, the rule of law is the means or the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Once this all gets brought out to the American people, then is whenever we, the people, make our conscious decision to our people that eventually will vote either yea or nay in this impeachment House hearings that could jeopardize the presidency of Mr. Donald J. Trump. Once more, we want to thank you for listening, those that do listen. We want to thank you for allowing for us to be part of your lives in regard to sharing our feelings with your thoughts and your feelings. And we appreciate any prayers in the future pertaining to the Windmill Ministries missions that does in fact support wide world global utopia and peace, prosperity for all, and good luck to all of us, and shalom. That will wrap this up in part 1 of the House impeachment hearings affairs.
To the hearing of Robert Mueller himself after the special counsel delivered his report to the Congress. He was a reluctant witness. These witnesses are not reluctant, even though they still were quite measured in their presentation. And it's also striking how much of the testimony does come back to one of the subjects of Robert Mueller's investigation, Russia.
Exactly, George. These men, both persuasive, Taylor in particular, in complete command of the facts. When he's asked to read something, he doesn't hesitate. His memory is not faulty at all. And he is very direct. And two things struck me about his testimony. Number one, he painted Russia as an adversary, a complete adversary, one attacking the Ukraine, both politically and militarily. He talked about how Ukraine is in the strategic interest of the United States to protect them and to help them move along in their democracy. And then number two, that this, quote, irregular foreign policy that was being conducted by Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal attorney, ran counter to that. And that the notion that using the power and the purse strings of the United States government and a potential meeting with the President of the United States was something that was very negative in terms of helping the Ukraine because, quote, Putin was watching all of it, George.
That's right. And I want to come back to the table here as well. We've heard Mary Bruce talk about how it's important to hear from Gordon Sondland again. Time and time again over the course of the testimony from both Mr. Kent and Mr. Taylor. Kay, let me talk to you about this. It became very clear that the testimony of two people who are so far unwilling to testify, Mick Mulvaney and John Bolton, could be critical.
Yeah, I mean, I thought, so you have these two, non-political appointees, right? It's so interesting that Devin Nunes ended his opening with this kind of broadside against the politicized bureaucracy. And then you have these two career civil servants who are performing something very different, not appearing political at all, trying to be responsive. And when pressed for their view, was this right, was this irregular, answering candidly, but not in any kind of a political way. But I do think that some of the political appointees at the heart of the story are going to be critical. So Sondland, and as you said, Mulvaney and Bolton. At this point, I think that Mulvaney is going to only come before the Congress if he's compelled to do so by a court. I think that's probably true about Bolton as well, although he sent some mixed signals. And, as you said, some new information has come out today. I can see some twists and turns that could, in some universe, end up with hearing directly in some form from Bolton, and that would, of course, be critical because he was at the heart of so much of
Right,
this.
and the reason Mick Mulvaney important is that, according to Taylor's testimony, the president directed Mulvaney to put that freeze on the Ukraine military aid.
Right. According to him, that Mulvaney becomes kind of the executor between President Trump and the diplomats. But I think that Bolton is probably the single most important person who could still testify. And that's because he's political. It's because he has made it very clear throughout his career he is no fan of Democrats. He is no fan of the left. And if Bolton then comes forward and gives testimony which supports the account of the diplomats, and again, he's part of these conversations that they're talking about. He's there. He's the one saying apparently that this is like a drug deal. He's ending meetings, etc. If Bolton testifies to that, because he's so political and always has been, that makes his testimony even more powerful for Democrats.
The question is, does he want to?
Well, I think he has a very serious lawyer in Chuck Cooper, who is a constitutional scholar, worked at the Justice Department and before the Supreme Court. And so they